I thought we could begin by doing a little bit of stage setting to make sure sort of everyone sees how we're coming at this issue. So, philosophy, of course, has a really long history of engagement with artificial intelligence and with computation more generally. So before we get to some of the philosophy itself, in order to situate the kind of work that you're doing today, I thought we should talk a bit about what it means to think about AI philosophically and how that has changed over time. As many of the listeners probably know, one way of telling that story is to see a sort of transformation from this earlier period of philosophical focus on sort of logical, epistemic, metaphysical questions like, what is AI? Is it even possible? To this transformation to today, sort of this growing engagement with ethical, with political, with social questions. So my impression as sort of an informed outsider, not a professional philosopher, is that even just sort of 15 years ago, this kind of work barely existed. And if philosophy students in the English-speaking world in particular were reading anything about AI, it was probably something like John Searle on the Chinese room argument, who I suspect many of our listeners have some familiarity with. So speaking from my own experience doing some undergraduate philosophy at MIT, I don't really remember much energy or urgency around these kinds of questions, even just say 10 years ago. But of course, that's before all these incredible advances in machine learning and computing power really catapulted AI to public attention over the last decade. And in the wake of these developments, we've now got this very well-defined subfield of philosophy, the ethics of AI. And it's attracting a lot of new students, a lot of new scholars, and it's already generated this very rich, substantial literature that you're contributing to. So given these sort of changing contours, I just thought we could begin by asking where do you sort of see your own work, not just on the ethics of AI, but also on the political philosophy of AI. Where do you see your work fitting in to this sort of disciplinary context? And in particular, what does it mean to think about AI from a sort of political philosophy tradition, in addition to sort of a moral philosophy tradition?
Yeah, excellent question. I mean, I think your diagnosis of the evolving field of philosophy of AI is exactly right. We've seen a really increased focus on normative questions, broadly construed, so that obviously includes moral, but also social, legal, and political questions surrounding AI and machine learning. We've seen those kinds of questions crop up recently, I think, for a number of reasons. One of these reasons is that there is just an increased body of work coming from computer science and applied statistics, as well as applied mathematics, where a lot of fantastic contributions recently have looked at the technical side, the kind of technological sources of phenomena like algorithmic bias. And so given that we now have more information about these kinds of technological problems, the ethical and political questions associated with these kinds of findings are just becoming much more urgent and much more salient. So there's a kind of natural reason why, in light of this new information, or just more information about this topic, philosophers have responded by applying existing kind of value theoretic paradigms to that domain. But I also think AI research more generally tends to move in various waves. So on the technological side, we've seen multiple AI winters in the 70s and 90s, where previously we had a big hype around some form of machine learning innovation. And then we had a backlash effect after that, where a lot of funding wasn't available anymore for projects in that area. And so given that we know that the field as such moves in relatively uneven dynamics, we can also expect that even though there is a lot of interest in AI ethics right now, there might be a wave to that as well, where we will see a backlash effect. And in fact, arguably, that is happening to some extent now, in the sense that people have become quite skeptical of the idea of applying an ethics lens specifically rather than a political lens. So one key concern that non-philosophers often voice is that ethics is a pretty toothless perspective to apply when we're dealing with problems like immense racial injustice or gender injustice when it comes to algorithmic outputs. So non-philosophers tend to look at AI ethics work and kind of say, well, why do we really need to talk about values in this area? Why don't we just talk about things like power or justice? But of course, philosophers will know that moral philosophers and also political philosophers really care about exactly those types of questions. So I guess the question is, what explains that? And I guess an easy answer is, well, we have a lot of ethicists in the tech industry who essentially are compliance officers, right? So there's a kind of ambiguity around the term ethics itself, where a lot of technology practitioners will have encountered an ethicist, but that's basically the person who makes sure that the company doesn't get into hot water. Now, that's very different from doing proper moral and political philosophy of AI and asking questions like, what is this phenomenon of algorithmic injustice? Who's really wronged by, disparate output distributions? What should we do about that? Who should take a part in, making decisions about where AI should be deployed? Do we maybe have different intuitions about using AI in public institutions that serve really important integral functions in a democratic state? Vis-a-vis deploying AI in various private sector settings. So all of these kinds of questions kind of naturally arise, but often don't get tackled by ethicists working from a kind of legal compliance perspective, but very much are being tackled by this wealth of new work in philosophy. Now, within that, obviously, I'm very interested in questions that surround algorithmic injustice. So I think it's really important to have an accurate and sufficiently encompassing notion in mind of what algorithmic injustice is in the first place. So one kind of lens we might take here is to say, well, algorithmic injustice is this fundamentally new phenomenon that requires entirely new philosophical concepts. But when we look at existing cases of algorithmic bias, we actually see that the kinds of longer standing, deeply entrenched social and political and economic injustices that we are deeply familiar with and that political philosophers have been thinking about for a long time actually just resurface in often surprising, often conceptually interesting ways, but they are part of a larger scale problem in society, right? So we see structures of social injustice being replicated and amplified by AI. So I think that's a good moment for us to, investigate how we can actually draw on all of this longer standing work in political philosophy that has to do with different notions of justice and see how it applies in this very urgent domain. I think, and this is the last thing I'll say about it, there are two other important political philosophy type questions in this area, possibly more, but I'll just mention two that I think are especially urgent. One of them has to do with control over AI, right? So who should be able to make judgment calls about where and if AI and machine learning tools ought to be deployed somewhere. And so the problem that we're wrestling with at the moment is that actually there's just a complete devolution of control to the tech industry, right? Because we lack expertise on the policy side. The tech industry moves much faster than any sort of government agency and the wider citizenry, of course. But that doesn't really resolve the normative question of who ought to be able to make decisions about these really consequential, judgment calls that we need to make here. In particular, I think, exercising much more democratic control and agenda setting surrounding questions about the goals that we're trying to pursue with AI in the first place would be really important. So what we don't really need is, every citizen needs to become a computer scientist and, understand the intimate inner workings of every single machine learning tool. What we do need is, democratic citizens deliberating about what we're trying to achieve when we automate, right? And so that's a value-based question that ought to be on the forefront of people's minds and increasingly is. And so that, I think, is a very important focal point for political philosophers of AI. The second question that I think is really exciting and important and urgent in this context is the question of how and why we ought to improve technology, right? So the optimization is a big buzzword in the tech industry, and optimization sounds really great. There's nothing kind of intuitively worrying about making things better. But as it turns out, making things better can often move us further away from our bigger political and social goals. I bet this will come up in more detail later in our conversation. But the kind of headline for political philosophy is that we ought to pay attention to how approximating one type of ideal might actually make us compromise on another set of ideals. And so we have to have a clear view in mind of what we're actually aspiring to when we say things like, oh, let's optimize these great tools. So I'll leave it at that. I'm very open to the idea that political philosophers of AI can tackle many other exciting and interesting questions, but those are some of the ones that I'm thinking about right now.
Yeah, that all seems right to me. And thinking in particular about this accent that you place on the need to look at values in particular, especially vis-a-vis the devolution of control that currently exists for the tech industry. I think probably another factor at work here is sort of this is a separation. There's a sort of a fact-value separation that's sort of endemic to a lot of, especially English-speaking Anglophone, the English-speaking Anglophone philosophical tradition. So one thing that's interesting to me as sort of an outsider looking at the ethics of AI literature, in addition to all the things that you've just said, is trying to think about what it means to respond, for philosophy to respond in these normative ways to things that are usually cordoned off as issues about facts or technical matters. I think this manifests in a few different ways, and I think it's part of the same story that you just told. I mean, in the Anglophone world, you have lots of philosophers who are trained to think about hardcore logical, technical, analytic sort of issues in a very mathematical or quasi-mathematical way. There's an emphasis on a certain kind of rigor and formalism that often can insulate some work in the field from this kind of normative value ethical reflection. So I'm just thinking about, for example, you have lots of people who identify in the English-speaking world as philosophers of science, but not so many people who identify professionally as like a philosopher of technology. So I think one thing that's interesting about this transformation is it's trying to sort of rebuild this conception of what it means to think about technology philosophically. Another element of that problem is that an obstacle that we're up against is not just the devolution of power to the tech industry, but also this deeply entrenched sense that you've got facts on one side and values on the other, and I'm going to outsource ethical, normative, political, social thinking to someone else. That's above my pay grade, or I just can't be bothered to think about it. So it's interesting. I think this will come out and some of the other questions we explore, but to think about how we can circumvent that deeply embedded temptation to put facts and technique and technical issues on one side and values and on the other. Mm-hmm. So that makes me think as well. In this. Let's drill down a little bit into some features of this sort of new ethics of AI literature, which, as you've said, has elicited both lots of praise and also some criticism for being arguably sort of toothless. So last year, you and a couple of your colleagues, Elena De Rosa and Sunny Kem, published this really interesting essay with us at Boston Review called "Technology Can't Fix Algorithmic Injustice," which went on to win the Hastings Center's Early Career Essay Award. So congratulations on that. But so one thing you noted in that piece is that to the extent that moral or normative questions about AI do have a little bit of a longer legacy than, say, the last decade, they tend to be concerned with like apocalyptic scenarios. So with the singularity, with superintelligence, with the risk of human extinction at the hands of very sophisticated robot overlords. As you and your co-authors pointed out, this orientation can make it seem like there's nothing to worry about in the here and now. And I think one really important corrective of work like yours in the ethics and politics of AI is to redirect our attention away from the relatively far off threats of so-called general AI, as important as and existentially dire as they might actually be, to the actually existing threats and harms of AI that is already being deployed, with countless examples from facial recognition in law enforcement and recidivism predictors in the criminal justice system, to risk assessment calculators in banking. Sociologists, journalists, and other tech critics had sort of been sounding alarms about these things for a little bit, but philosophical attention really sort of exploded, I think, after Cathy O'Neill's important 2016 book, Weapons of Math Destruction. And then a couple of years later, when Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru published this sort of explosive paper about gender and racial bias in facial recognition systems. So at the same time, even as you've gotten a lot of this philosophical attention in the wake of these concerns, much of the popular conversation has tended to focus on a small number of sort of recurring themes. So you've got this issue of like non-representative training data. So like using a database of mostly white or mostly male faces to train a neural network or something like that. So that's one sort of recurring theme, the question of sort of training data and is it representative or not. Even more recently, you've got a lot of focus on this question of interpretability and the problem of sort of uninterpretable artificial neural networks. So these neural networks deal with sort of these weights between nodes that don't have any obvious meaning in the way that, say, like the coefficients in a classical regression model are sort of more easily interpretable. So you've got this training data problem, you've got this interpretability problem, and people also talk about a sort of external validity problem, making sure that your tool is robust to departures from the data that you sort of trained it on. So I think these are the sort of some of the main recurring themes in this discourse. But at the same time, in some quarters, there's this temptation to view the problem as sort of easily fixable or relatively narrow or even like purely technical. So if you think the big problems are your training data is just not representative, then maybe the fix is just sort of simple. We just have to use representative data sets that don't only use white male faces or something like that, right? Or if you think the issue is just sort of inaccuracy across different sort of subgroups of the population, maybe the fix is relatively easy. You just have to audit your system a little more and make sure that before you release it, you have sort of equitable accuracy profiles across sort of different subgroups or something. And I think one line of sort of work that this has generated is trying to sort of solve these technical problems, which are much more widely acknowledged now, but with technical means. So trying to solve technical solutions with technical problems. You have this sort of cottage industry now of people trying to develop so-called debiasing algorithms, where if the problem is that your algorithm is sort of doing something in a biased way, well, hey, the solution is that you can just wheel in this sort of debiasing algorithm and that'll fix it. There's also an important and emerging field of computer science itself, the sort of fairness, accountability, and transparency in machine learning that's coming out of computer science practitioners themselves that tries to deal with it. So I guess it seems to me that like in the wake of all these new characterizations of algorithmic injustice, one role for philosophy in particular is to help characterize the larger or the full space of sort of what algorithmic injustice looks like. So to point out that it's not just that AI can be harmful, but to clarify precisely how and why and to illuminate the many different forms that the harm can take. So thinking about these sort of common assessments of what counts as an AI failure or an AI harm, maybe we could pivot and talk a little bit about like what are some of the other ways that AI technologies can be morally or politically objectionable beyond just, say, relying on bad data or being more or less accurate or relying on data that consent wasn't given for. So maybe to expand our sense of just exactly what injustice can inhere in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you're totally right to say that there is a real temptation, particularly in the more technical communities working on this topic, to cash out these normative problems as purely technical ones that, ought to be addressed first and foremost via technical intervention. So imposing particular, quantifiable constraints on our AI systems. I wouldn't say that those communities also think that those are easy problems. In fact, there's a kind of current impasse that we're at the moment in this kind of interdisciplinary community that includes computer scientists, where a lot of computer science work, which has been very influential, has been pointing out that actually it's technologically impossible, it's mathematically impossible to reconcile multiple intuitively plausible fairness measures with each other in the same system, right? So often we face the situation where there's a trade-off between, representing the social world accurately. So computer scientists would say, achieving high calibration. So we're working with a model that accurately reflects the social status quo. And on the other hand, making sure that our algorithmic outputs are moving us closer towards a plausible conception of fairness. Now, very often we can't do that because we would have to either decide, okay, no, what we really want is for our system to represent the unjust social status quo, and we're just going to be happy with that type of accuracy. But we're going to take for a given that means that we will continue to make unjust decisions. So for instance, in the criminal justice system, we're going to have disproportionately high recidivism risk rates attributed to Black defendants. Or we could say, we don't really care so much about calibration. What we really want is more equitable outcomes. But that means we have to adopt different decision rules for different socio-demographic groups. And so that's a trade-off that computer scientists tend to look at and just say, that's an impossibility theorem. So we can't really do anything here. And so that's a really dangerous way of responding to any sort of impossibility theorem, or in fact, any sort of dilemmatic situation. Because again, it contributes to this kind of learned helplessness where we think, oh, all of these things seem kind of good, but if we can't achieve all of them at once, then, who are we to decide what we ought to do here? So that's, I think, where moral and political philosophy of AI really ought to come in, including, of course, also other communities outside of philosophy and computer science, to really, advance arguments about what kind of conception of justice we really ought to realize here. So thinking kind of beyond this logic of trade-offs and impossibility and moving more towards a logic of prioritizing between different types of fairness conceptions in light of the fact that we're working in a deeply unjust and a structurally unjust social status quo. And so because we have this background structure of social injustice along many different axes, it's not going to be sufficient to actually optimize in one domain, right? So we can't look at one type of algorithmic decision scenario in isolation and kind of say, okay, so our primary goal is to sort out this trade-off and like to pick the right conception of fairness, and then we're good. Those outputs will be fair enough. Because of course, the kinds of outputs that we get in one decision scenario will interact with many, many other decision scenarios that citizens move throughout their lives. And so as AI becomes more and more enmeshed in all kinds of different decision scenarios, there will still be this interplay between social injustice broadly construed and things like algorithmic bias. And so that then suggests that actually the problem space is much, much bigger. In a way, we can't really fix algorithmic injustice by just fixing algorithms, right? So this kind of means that larger scale social and political and also legal interventions are required here in order to transform the kinds of institutions and decision makers that choose to deploy AI in order to, make their decisions more efficiently. So just kind of accelerating what we're already doing and making sure that that process runs smoothly falls short of a plausible conception of social justice, in my view. Actually, because you mentioned facial recognition before, I think that's a really good example, because people tend to look at the work on racial and gender bias and facial recognition, and they tend to kind of say, okay, well, let's just have better data. And so as soon as we have that, our system is accurate. The question that just completely falls away in that case is the question of, should we be trying to accelerate existing policing practices in the first place, right? So given the level of structural injustice that plagues the criminal justice system, for instance, in the US, but obviously also in many other places, is the most just decision we can make to just make sure that that existing set of practices runs more smoothly. Now, I say no, right? So I don't think that's a plausible conception of justice at all. But addressing this kind of problem will require thinking about, equality under the law first, and the rights of the state to, intervene into citizens' lives in particular ways, and how that interacts with social justice first before we make these judgment calls about, should we accelerate and optimize in this particular domain. Actually, also then thinking about, how do we get this better data? Important political questions arise. It's not like collecting more data is going to be a straightforward process. So again, facial recognition. There was this really important case last year where it turned out that a Google subcontractor was approaching, Black and brown homeless people on the street and was deceptively trying to get more image data from their faces by showing them, an iPad and saying something like, just play this fun selfie game or just answer this survey and we'll give you $5, without disclosing that actually that image data would be recorded and used to train these kinds of tools that then get used in law and immigration enforcement. And so that seems like a very extractive, exploitative process to me. So not only is there a lot of deception involved in this particular case, it's worth thinking about, what if there wasn't this kind of deception? It would still mean that we would have to directly target people in order to obtain a lot of data from them. And I think also in this case, the particularly disturbing feature of this kind of scenario would be that exactly the kinds of social groups that are already at the receiving end of structural injustice, particularly in law enforcement, would then have to either volunteer or be forced to provide their image data in order to make these tools run more smoothly. So to me, that raises straightforward questions of exploitation. So there is a kind of independent wrong at stake here that is politically urgent and that can't easily be subsumed just into these discussions around accuracy. Right? So we need to pay attention to these independent moral and political wrongs, and whether we're comfortable imposing these kinds of wrongs on citizens and non-citizens as we try to move closer to more just AI. I think in many cases, actually, we just shouldn't try to optimize in that way. So if we can only get better data sets by exploiting those who are already oppressed by existing structures of injustice, then that just seems like the wrong strategy. That doesn't sound like a feasible and desirable political ideal.
Absolutely. There's so much there that I'd like to pull out. One thing I want to do is circle back a little bit to what you say about sort of learned helplessness. And I think one important feature of the public conversation about this in particular is the virtue of trying to demystify some of the taken for grantedness that has sort of already accumulated around AI technologies. And I think one of the flip sides of all the important attention that is now being devoted to this issue, both in the academy and outside, is that it may inadvertently reinforce a kind of like tunnel vision or a kind of AI like exceptionalism. This idea that AI is something totally new, it's profoundly revolutionary, we've never dealt with anything like this before. In many of the ways that you just explained, these are natural questions that emerge in all kinds of scenarios. But you can see how too uncritical an embrace of this kind of way of buying into the AI sort of revolution can blind us to some resources and lessons of history that might seek to sort of undo some of the learned helplessness. If you think about sort of AI as, if you purchase into sort of the revolutionary rhetoric, you can perpetuate this tendency to think of technology sort of ahistorically, as the blessing or curse of sort of individual geniuses in Silicon Valley, or as the sort of disembodied unfolding of technological determinist reason, or as sort of this solely technical matter, instead of the product of all of these social and political forces that are always at work, instead of seeing technology as deeply embedded in society at large, and in all these ways that you just explained. So new technologies, of course, have always posed precisely these sorts of you've identified some sorts of questions that are genuinely new, but you've also identified many schemas of questions that have sort of always been there about any kind of technology, about nuclear technology, about new forms of biotechnology. So I'm wondering, before we sort of get to the Q&A part of the conversation, if what, if anything, do you think makes AI special, or what can we sort of learn by thinking about this AI revolution, such as it is, in relation to sort of other earlier technological revolutions, and our capacity for responding, regulating, doing moral deliberation?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the one obviously unique feature of AI is precisely AI exceptionalism. I think very rarely before have we seen so much reluctance and timidness, both from regulators, but also citizens, to actually, intervene critically in discussions about the purpose of automating in various domains of social life. So with other technologies, we often see this kind of dynamic of innovative disruption of some type of industry. Often the economic fallout of that will trigger a public debate in which more and more people get pulled in. Now, it's true that with many technological innovations, industry will still lead that conversation, and the same is still true for AI. It's just that in the case of recent AI systems, industry has really captured and monopolized not only discussions about AI proper, but also discussions about AI ethics to some extent. And there are many economic and sociological reasons for that. One of them just is that tech industry, players are able to attract an immense amount of talent. There are really strong economic incentives for talented young researchers to move into industry. But obviously, that doesn't mean that what they would say were they, employed in a government agency or, in some activist role, or if they were working in academia, that won't just be the same as the kind of work that we'll see coming out of corporate teams publishing papers around these questions. So that's the situation that we're currently in. I also think, though, that actually we're facing a dual problem space here, of which learned helplessness is only one side. So learned helplessness often surfaces in this kind of notion that either we just know too little about AI, there's too much uncertainty around it, so it would be wrong and indeed unreasonable to make any strong judgment calls, or we just lack ethical expertise, we can't possibly reason normatively. Very common amongst computer scientists. You can kind of see why that happens, right? in a way, it's kind of nice to see recognition of the fact that developing ethical and political reasoning skills might take training, and that we do have experts for that. But I guess I'm skeptical of the more general idea that we need ethical experts, and those experts ought to be philosophers necessarily in this domain. I think actually very often tech practitioners and computer scientists ought to dare to ask themselves these complicated and often not quantifiable ethical and political questions, because often they're the ones very well placed to intervene in those questions. But of course, that can go wrong as well. And this is the second horn of the dilemma, so to speak, which is this notion, which again is very common in the tech industry, that our team is the good team. And so the way in which that works is if you work in a big tech company that has a designated ethical AI team, it might be the case that you're working on these really important and urgent questions. And obviously, you think of your team as doing really great work in that space. So you will feel emboldened to make really consequential, normatively salient decisions that may not actually be representative of what the democratic citizenry at large would choose. So, obtaining democratic authorization for that set of norms that often gets realized just wouldn't happen if we didn't have so much influence by the corporate sector in this domain. So that's a case in which I think tech experts and tech practitioners overestimate their ability to make representative and democratically accountable decisions. And so both of these extremes are obviously bad, right? So we don't want people saying, we can't possibly represent all of society, so we won't make any decisions about fairness, because of course that will entrench the status quo. On the other hand, we don't want people overreaching and, in many cases, actually actively rebuking efforts to, subject these decisions to public scrutiny and control. So both of these dynamics, I think, are uniquely salient at the moment. And the fix for that, of course, would be to get rid of this timidness that we currently have around AI. So with many other innovative technologies or just scientific questions and topics, we've become comfortable with the idea of subjecting them to democratic decision making. So climate change issues, or you mentioned biotechnology issues, nuclear technology. These kinds of topics have been on democratic agendas before and luckily continue to be. The same kind of process needs to happen with AI and machine learning. Of course, particularly when we deploy them in public institutions, but arguably, even with private sector applications, given that private sector applications will just still affect most or all citizens in a very severe way. So that's, I think, what we should strive to. And the kind of severity of that problem is maybe particularly strong in the case of AI.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. And I think, another feature of this sort of phenomenon of this temptation to outsource or delegate ethical expertise, I think another virtue of thinking historically about AI and situating it within sort of the larger history of technological change is that as you've just identified in all these subtle ways, rethinking our relationship to this particular form of technology, might require rethinking other sorts of political commitments and our relationship to other sort of dimensions of society, from to speak abstractly, from capitalism to technocracy, in the way that you just spoke of, sort of ethical outsourcing. So I think one moral here is that again, to sort of reiterate the point about trying to resist the fact sort of value afterlife, one theme that emerges from all these characterizations is that technology is related in all these profound ways to other dimensions of social life that might themselves have to be changed or tinkered with if you want to answer the sort of normative technological questions. Man, we're running out of time so quickly. It's a shame. I did want to get in one more question I wanted to get in before we sort of open it up to everyone, is that I wanted to think a little bit about, I mean, I do think there is this promising attention devoted to sort of AI harms. We have an uphill battle facing the domination of the conversation by interested actors, but fortunately there's a lot of activity around this kind of moral deliberation. There is an interesting sort of argument that comes from some quarters that says maybe we shouldn't try thinking so much about the harms of AI, but about the good that AI can do. So one ethical argument that's sometimes made for more AI is that it can correct, or it like holds out the possibility of correcting bias in human judgment or the limitations of human processing power. So humans on this view like suffer from unconscious bias and overt prejudice and limited information, but machines and algorithms are objective or neutral. They give us like the unbiased truth. So a machine can't deny you that loan just because it doesn't like you, or misread your x-ray because it's tired, or it missed some crucial piece of information in your medical chart. But a human can do those things. So on this view, human reasoning is messy, inaccurate, error prone, and in the worst case is evil. And sophisticated AI, goes one argument, is supposed to sort of promises to liberate us from all that mess. So I'm wondering if we could sort of get in quickly what sort of your response to that kind of view might be, and what like just constructive uses of AI might look like. So for us to think about that question alongside these very important questions about the limitations and harms of current technologies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I really agree with this concern about fallible and biased human decision makers. It's not like, the alternative to algorithmic decision making and machine learning that is just exclusively controlled by humans is going to be, morally and politically superior just because we live in our, deeply unjust world. We're deeply shaped by it. It's very hard to extricate ourselves from that, which, has the same reason why it's really hard to disentangle technology from these deeply entrenched injustices. The kind of logic that dominates these discussions about using AI for good, though, often doesn't take into account the importance of defining our problem space, our decision problem carefully enough, with political and moral values in mind. And just to give you one example, consider this this kind of argument applied to something like a recidivism risk prediction system of the kind that we use in criminal justice. So you might kind of say, well, we're interested in predicting recidivism risk. We could use a human judge here, and if that judge didn't get their lunch, they're going to make a terrible decision here. And so that argument checks out. I mean, we have empirical proof of that. You can imagine various other kinds of, random biases, or just, bias motivated by social stereotypes. All of that will lead to, bad or unjust outcomes. So we might think, okay, let's get rid of that bias by just making it impossible for human bias to come in. Let's, default to using AI in order to predict recidivism risk. Now, of course, that might be better in some way, but the question we're not asking then is, why are we predicting recidivism risk when we're trying to make decisions about who should go to jail and for how long? And it might just turn out that the most just question to ask in this context is not how we can accurately predict recidivism risk, right? So that might matter to some extent, or it might not matter at all. But that's going to be a political decision that we have to make. Unfortunately, what happens is when we engage in this comparative logic of looking at fallible human decision makers and potentially optimizable AI systems, we're kind of ignoring this deeper question of setting ourselves a just agenda. Right? And so that can lead to de facto effects that then actually make it harder for us to intervene later. So for instance, we might just opt out of implementing already feasible political and legal transformations. So in the criminal justice context, for instance, that could mean rethinking mandatory minimum sentences, or emphasizing rehabilitative approaches or abolitionist approaches. So there is a kind of range of different political, legal, social interventions that are available to us that we might de facto deprioritize or even forget about if we're just engaging in this comparative exercise. Now, that being said, I do think that there might be some important roles for AI deployment when it comes to diagnosing these kinds of biases that happen. So there's some interesting recent work in this kind of interdisciplinary fact community that focuses on this question of, not how do we just make AI more fair, but how can we deliberately deploy it in a decision scenario that we know to be prone to bias, and use AI to really locate and precisely diagnose the ways in which that bias plays out. Of course, I have a warning about that kind of approach too, not to over focus on the harms, but I do think it's important to remember there that actually a lot of the kinds of classic cases of decision-making scenarios in which we see bias aren't as complex as supporters of this approach might assume, in the sense that it's often just not plausible that we need really sophisticated AI to establish support for the claim that bias is happening in that domain. So again, thinking about criminal justice, we know that racial and gender bias to some extent and other forms of bias, so for instance, class bias, plays a really important role there. We have quantitative and qualitative social science research on this question. We have direct lived experiences of citizens interacting with the criminal justice system that makes it very clear that this bias is present. Do we need sophisticated AI to establish support for that claim? Not necessarily. But of course, it's possible that there may be some domains of social and political life in which we have less clarity about the location and scope of such biases. In those cases, it might be a very good idea to use AI as a heuristic device. Again, we just shouldn't overestimate the potential of deploying AI there. And we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that just because we've deployed AI as a heuristic device excuses us from making these really complex political judgments, right? So what does it really mean for us that we've diagnosed bias in this domain? We still have to take some action in response to that. And so that's why it's just never going to be the case that AI is going to exclusively or just entirely fix a given social problem.
Yeah, that's great. And that resonates in some parts there with a question from a listener. So I think I'll just go ahead and read this question and see where it leads. The listener asks, a common problem is the dissociation sort of between tech designers and developers and the remote moral consequences of their decisions. And the listener asks, how can we make AI developers more directly responsible for the ethical consequences of their design decisions and their product offerings? I think one assumption that's embedded there is that the right response is to sort of think about individual responsibility. So we have I think another element of this important question is whether the right kinds of responses take place at a sort of legal level of holding particular companies or even particular developers responsible in some form or another, or whether the responses have to take some other sort of larger structural sort of form. Yeah, so I'll let you weigh
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I guess in many different cases, we're not primarily going to worry about holding an individual developer accountable for taking part in the development and design of a tool that ends up causing harm. There are many reasons for that. One of them is just a pure feasibility reason. So given that, large teams work on complex tools over long periods of time, it'll just be really difficult to attribute particular outcome responsibilities to individual agents here. Again, a familiar problem in philosophy, right? So what do we do with these collective agents who do harmful things? Who's liable to address these harms? And so unless we kind of buy into the idea that within a collective agent, for instance, a corporate developer team, we're going to attribute responsibility kind of hierarchically, we're going to face problems really sorting out who's responsible for what. But I guess there's also a non-feasibility reason, a kind of desirability reason why we might want to resist the focus on individual accountability here in many cases. And that's just the kind of structural power and influence that big corporations wield in this domain. That seems like a very urgent problem to address in comparison to, adopting an approach that allows us to sue engineer X and team XYZ. So I view a focus on auditing and holding accountable corporations as such and limiting their democratic agenda setting power is really, really crucial here. Actually, that extends not only to situations in which the deployment of some AI tool causes some disparate output that is really harmful for some or all citizens. It also extends to just the ability of corporations to stifle public debate on some issues and steer debate towards other issues. And it's kind of similar to these longer standing money and politics questions where powerful players that are not democratically authorized and not democratically accountable have the capability of shaping public discourse around these questions in a way that not only obfuscates their own role in causing harm, but also immunizes them against future accountability and auditing efforts. So in a way, what we need is a more structural institutional focus here, coupled perhaps with regulatory intervention that comes more from a consumer protection side. So some of that work is actually going on at the moment. There's been a lot of movement in the kind of AI policy debate recently, where scholars like Deborah Raji have made really important arguments about allowing third-party actors that are independent from this corporate influence, but also somewhat removed from regulatory agencies to audit new technologies and to provide expert input on the implications of using these kinds of tools. And so I think that kind of approach is really promising and plausible. So really looking at, okay, what sorts of expert communities do we already have? Which sorts of activist groups do we have who have that direct expertise and on the ground knowledge and who are therefore capable of providing really informed input into public debates. Of course, that's not going to be enough, right? So we also need this broader democratic conversation that I mentioned before. But I think in order to really start thinking more seriously about accountability, we're going to need that independent perspective.